I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me. It sounds weird to say that your first date was a drive, but I think it was pretty sweet. I'm a photographer. I've been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got a fantastic eye for locations, and my photos have been featured not just in people's living rooms, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road. A young woman was sitting on the hood, waving her hands at me, asking if I'd stop. I rolled down my window to see how I could help, and I remember her relieved look to this day. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at an oil change, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed, and ended up hanging out with me for the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for about 3 hours, and I was the only person she knew. So we talked between photo shoots. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair, and we sat around and chatted as I took candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterward, and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say. It wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've always considered it our first date. We even went back on our first anniversary and put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe that had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep it up, and we stop at it sometimes, so that we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You'd put 50 cents into the basket, the booth is never manned, and head on your way. I have no idea who comes out to collect the money. I don't imagine that it makes a lot of money out here, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when they put him out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It had been a busy week. We just put a down payment on a new house, my wife had just started a new job, and I'd just finished shooting for a big wedding that had more than paid for the down payment on a new house, but left us a little light otherwise. We'd cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and we'd forgotten to put some change back to pay the toll with. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to the lake where the wedding had been held on that long ago day. The lake was where we had our wedding, and we went there sometimes to picnic or swim, or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I'd managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I'd thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the insipid toll. But such things were a little too rebellious for me. You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "Nope," she said, looking in her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, that's a little better, but not quite 50 cents. Just get some out of the change cup." I shook the cup at her, reminding her that we'd recently traded it in. "Oh." She looked contemplative. "Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I was sure that my car's wheels would bog down at any second. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected that my tires would spew up earth and stick as I maneuvered around the barricade. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed, and I wondered why I simply hadn't done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I'd been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before driving home, and snuggle in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she'd never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the road winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving those leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply could not believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John," she asked, sounding perplexed, "does something seem off about the trees?" I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens, looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on TV, I guess. They look kinda glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week. We'd been through a pretty stressful time, and it was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes on the road again, wanting to be there already. We'd driven for about 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking someone must be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was a simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one? My wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed. They were getting a little greedy, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, watching it disappear in the rear-view mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking rapidly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the usual reds and oranges and greens, but something did seem a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as I watched it go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all this would be normal again. This was weird, yes, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it was. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to get past these weird technicolor trees and into the deep woods I knew were coming. We'd driven for another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It couldn't be. I'd been driving this road for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We'd passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. What the hell? My wife asked, and when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I'd meant it. Maybe, she started, pausing as she looked a little nervous. Maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I'd been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with one toll booth, so they added 2 more? This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, well, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator, and the frickin' president if they thought they could, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people in so they could, John? I stomped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I'd yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage. But she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves, and pointing with a shaky finger. "Look," she said. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine as I tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. "What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it! Don't do this!" The engine growled as I nudged it to 80. "John!" my wife said. But it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm, and I laughed as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made many mistakes that day, but damaging that booth was the worst. My wife screeched when we hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her, and I immediately felt sorry for what I'd done. My foot came off the ignition, and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the 2-lane road. I damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it'd be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the incident, but finally just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized that my wife had been silent this whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for getting so nuts over this, but she wasn't paying attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. I'm sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so..." "The trees are wrong, John. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see them. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it looked when we'd first seen that toll booth. I put my foot back on the ignition, and we kept rolling towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter the ramshackle booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help. The sky, it became darker and darker as we drove. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated the trees became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car or seen a deer or seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept glancing at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay. But I was on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it could have been since one of us had spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against these ideas. We were just a little lost on a road that we'd driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. Sure, I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we could come out of it okay. We shouldn't have driven around it. "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth," she said, turning towards me and looking afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "That's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I'd been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I'd never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines I'd come to love. The trees I could see in my headlights looked more like maples, with a thick, dark sap running from them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking back at me sometimes, wanting me to look back. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue that we seemed stuck, and it all started after we drove around that toll booth. "Quick," I said. "Dig under the seats and see if you can find another 15 cents. She just looked at me. 15 cents! I nearly growled at her. That way, if we see that toll booth again, we can pay the toll and we can get the hell out of here. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the farther we drove, the more I also believed we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, a bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running in the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. "I think I see a quarter on the track of the seat, but I can't reach it. Can you pull over so I can get it?" I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my light still glaring into the woods, and I told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but that it kept slipping through her fingers. I growled at her to be quick, and when I looked back to the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat with black ridges and overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflect off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol?" I said, not taking my eyes off that creature. "Almost got it," she replied. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but it wouldn't have mattered if she were a giant at that moment. I pulled her back into the car, and I pushed my foot down on the accelerator as the door bumped shut, and we got back on the road. I think if I'd hesitated even for a moment, we'd both be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The creature's chest would have caved in the front of my car, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed the other creatures in hot pursuit as we flew down the road at 70. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see that pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead. Seemed like either way, our options were limited. They followed us for a long time, too long for animals that size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if we were going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just, and I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to do the job. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful collision. After some indiscernible amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come into view again, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin of those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money in the basket, whispered, "Sorry," as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland, and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it. But I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place I'd been in. It was like passing under the coolest waterfall that I could imagine. We got home without incident. But it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seems that even though we left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car is still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been changed not even a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in that cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules.